Welcome, everybody. I hope you're ready for an incredible night. Going to be a very rewarding night with Marc here. Much bigger turnout than I expected since we messed up all the communication this week. So I'm glad that somehow you found out about tonight. I know there are many, many people who are planning on joining us online. We got word today that a lot of people are going to be joining us online. And we will have this event up on YouTube about an hour after it's over tonight. So I'm going to have Marc teach. He is an expert at the Holy Land. He's one of the top archaeologists in the world, discovered biblical Bethsaida a few years ago on a dig. He's an antiquities scholar, very, very respected. And when he gives you the history of how the land came to be from the time of Abraham to now, and everything from all the partitions to the mess that we're seeing in the Middle East today, there's nobody that can articulate it better than Marc and help you understand how we got to where we're at, where it all came from, and then our response as believers. At the end, he loves questions. There is no dumb question with Marc. He loves to answer questions. Those of us that have been to Israel with him can attest to that. And so whatever questions you have, we want you to ask tonight. At the end, we'll have a time of Q&A. Without further ado, let me invite Marc Turnage to the stage.
All right, good evening, everyone. It's good to be back at Coastline and to see a lot of friendly and familiar faces. Before we begin kind of looking at our topic for this evening, I want to set a few parameters to kind of help us a little bit. Aaron's asked me to talk a bit about the build-up to the present reality that we see as it relates to specifically Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. That said, I want to define a few things, but I want to get two really big points across at the outset. However you tell the history of this land depends when you start your clock. Okay? And this is something that is very important for us to keep in mind, because if you start it in, let's say, 1948, the story is going to look different. If you start it in 1967, it will look different still. So part of what we want to look at tonight is when really should we start telling the story? Now, often we will say, well, this is the land God gave Israel, so therefore that just closes the argument. But unfortunately, in the marketplace of ideas today, that doesn't really translate well. So when we begin to talk about the formation of the modern state of Israel and the modern reality that we know today is Israel and Palestine, we're going to have to move our timeline up a little bit, and I'll explain that a bit further. The second point that is going to be very important for us to kind of wrap our brains around tonight is that terms change over time. Okay? There will be terms like Israel, like Palestine, that in history are going to evolve. What they mean in one period is not what they mean today. And so it's going to be important, because one of the things that you will find is sometimes you'll hear people say, well, there has never been a Palestinian state. And people will immediately, in fact, I saw this recently, where someone pulled up a Bible that was printed in 1905, and sure enough, in the map section, it said Palestine, so for them, that was the evidence. We have to become much more, I would say, nuanced in our understanding. So understand that over time, names are going to shift, and the geography tied to those names are going to shift, okay? So when we start our clock is important, and also understanding that while the names may be the same over long periods of time, what is meant by those names is going to shift. Everybody with me so far? Awesome. So let's kind of dive in with beginning with a timeline. And when we talk about the land of Israel, from especially a biblical perspective, we really start in what's called the Middle Bronze Age. This is the time period of the patriarchs. So around 2100 BC down to 1550 BC. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that's when they're there, okay? And the land at that time is called the land of Canaan. We then shift in 1550 BC down to 1200 roughly, being what's called the Late Bronze Age. This is the time period of the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. Moses, okay? Then in 1200 to 1000, we enter what's known as Iron Age 1. Bronze, why? Because the chief element for technology was bronze. All of a sudden, man begins to be able to smelt iron on a large scale, so we move to Iron Age 1. This is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Saul, okay, in your Bible. Then we shifted around 1000. 1000 is David. Now, there's not going to be a test on this, so you can relax and breathe easy. But from 1000 to 587 BC is Iron Age 2, but that's the core of the Old Testament. That's where we have David and Solomon in the united monarchy. That's where we have the divided monarchy with Solomon's son Rehoboam and Ahab and Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Hosea and Micah. All of them fit right here in Iron Age 2. Okay? 587 BC, the Babylonians come charging in and they destroy the kingdom of Judah. They destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple that was built by Solomon. And they deport the people of Judah into the Babylonian exile. Of course, we read about this in books like Kings, Jeremiah, Daniel. Then, in 587 down to 332, we actually call this period the Persian period, even though it starts out with the Babylonians. But the Babylonians get beat up pretty quickly by the Persians, and so we shift into the Persian period, and that closes your Old Testament. Okay? So this is where we have Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm going to just move this out of the way so for ease of. Okay? So this is the end of the Old Testament, Persian period. Then you know how in your printed Bibles you separate Old and New Testament with those two pages, one's blank and the other says the New Testament on it? All right, that's the Hellenistic period, because 332, the Persians are conquered by this young Macedonian who history remembers as Alexander the Great. Okay? And this begins this Hellenistic period that lasts down to 63 BC. 63 BC, Rome rides into town and begins their process of annexing the land of Israel into the Roman Empire. So from then 63 to 324 AD, this is the Roman period. That's the New Testament. The New Testament takes place in the Roman period. Okay? In the 4th century, 324, the Roman Empire first makes Christianity a legal religion, and then it converts to Christianity, and we call this the Byzantine Empire. Okay? The Christian Roman Empire that lasts down to 630. In 630, you have this surge of Arabs coming out of the Arabian Peninsula, and they are going to more or less conquer North Africa, what we think of as the Middle East today, And you're going to have a couple of different Arab empires during this time. But from 630 to 1099, we have what we would call the early Arab period. Okay? This is when Islam begins as a religion. All right? In 1099, you have the conquest of Jerusalem by these Europeans, primarily French, that we call the Crusaders. And they set up the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasts for 200 years, as you can see, down to 1299. Then the Crusaders are defeated in 1299 and kicked out of the land by a group known as the Mamluks. Now, you may never have heard of the Mamluks before. They were from Egypt. Very actually interesting group because their origins were Caucasian European slaves who actually revolted in Egypt, but they converted to Islam. Now, these guys, even if you haven't heard of them, you've all heard of Genghis Khan, right, and his golden horde? The Mamluks were the ones that stopped Genghis Khan's golden horde moving west. So these are pretty bad dudes. Okay? They last down to 1518, and in 1518 you have the last real empire on the face of the earth, what's known as the Ottoman Empire. Of course, their capital was Constantinople, what is today Istanbul. And they last until 1918. What's 1918? End of the First World War. Okay? This is going to become very important because the end of the First World War is going to shape the Middle East as we know it today. It's going to draw the lines, and then the end of the Second World War is going to kind of put everything in motion. Keep that in mind. So, 1918, we have the end of the Ottoman period, and the land of Israel then falls under the control of the British. So from 1918 until 1948, we have what is known as the period of the British Mandate. We're going to talk about that a bit later. 1947, the UN creates what is known as the Partition Plan of British mandated Palestine. We'll look at that a little bit. But in 1948, what winds up happening is a war. Initially, it starts between the Jews and the local Arabs in British mandated Palestine, but then later, 5 Arab armies join in it. And at the end, once the armistice lines have been settled, you have Israel, Jordan, and Egypt controlling the lands west of the Jordan River. And this will make sense a bit more in a moment when we start putting some maps to this. 1967, you have the infamous Six-Day War. And that's more or less what draws the lines that we think of today, where you have the present state of Israel, you have the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Okay, so about 5,000 years of history there. Okay, but we'll come back and look at a bit of all of this. Now, one of the things that we want to look at here briefly are some maps. Because if you really want to understand history, you have to understand geography. Geography dictates history. Okay? It's true in the Bible, it's true today. And we'll look at that in a moment and see. But let's talk a little bit about when we speak of the land of Israel presently and biblically, what we're dealing with. So let's start with a couple of things. First of all, we have Sea of Galilee, we have the Jordan River, and we have the Dead Sea. The lands that are going to be west of the Jordan River, these lands are what are known as Israel, or Palestine, or Cisjordan, meaning west of the Jordan. The lands to the east are called Transjordan, across the Jordan. Okay? Now, most of biblical Israel is west of the Jordan River. And this landscape looks like a loaf of French bread, if you're thinking about it north and south. Flat on the sides and puffy in the middle, okay? And so topographically, you have this area, what's called the coastal plain, that runs along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And you see how the Carmel mountain range kind of cuts it across, but then it picks up here and it then eventually gets cut off completely up in what is today modern Lebanon. Then you have the central mountain range, and this is that ridge of that French loaf that I've just said. Okay? This is where the heart of biblical Israel is. Places like Hebron, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Shiloh, Shechem. Okay? All of those sit in that central mountain area there. Then you have what is known as the Jordan Valley. This valley is part of the longest scar on the face of the planet, what is known as the Syro-African Rift. And the only freshwater source in the land is the Jordan River, natural I should say, other than rain, and the Lake of Galilee, which is the lowest freshwater lake on the planet, 600 feet below sea level. Okay? The Dead Sea, which is a salt mineral concentration of 33%, considering that most oceans are about 2%. That's why you float when you go to the Dead Sea. This is the lowest place on the face of the planet at about 1,300 feet below sea level. So this long scar, which is created by a couple of tectonic plates here, is going to create the buckling of all the land around here. And it actually becomes very important in terms of defining the geography to the west and to the east of the Jordan Rift Valley. And then finally, we get the area of what is called the Transjordanian Highlands or the Transjordan Plateau. Okay? So that's kind of the land that we're dealing with here, moving west to east. Here you can get a satellite image that really brings out the contours a bit more drastically. Again, you have the coastal plain here. You have Mount Carmel sticking like a finger up into the Mediterranean. You have this ridge of the French loaf, this central hill country here. You have the Jordan River Valley here, Sea of Galilee in the north, Jordan River, Dead Sea, and then the Transjordanian Plateau here. Okay? I'm kind of being repetitive on this because it becomes important when we start talking about the history of the peoples that settle this land. As I said, geography dictates history. And one of the realities, even when we open the Bible, the biblical authors often assume that we know this geography, not just in the sense of places on a map or hills and valleys and waterways, but also road and regional dynamics, also flora and fauna. The biblical authors assume our knowledge of that because this land becomes not just the stage where the Bible plays out, but it also becomes the metaphor that biblical writers like the psalmist, the prophets, use to describe God and his encounter with the people. Okay? So it's something that's not just important even when we think modern, but also for us as people who read the book. Now, we're kind of jumping into our timeline to the period of Iron Age 2. Now, here you have the kingdom is divided, and you'll remember the story in the Old Testament. Solomon dies. His son Rehoboam becomes king. The people come to Rehoboam and say, listen, your dad really taxed us. Please stop. So Rehoboam turns to the elders and they say, listen to the people. But then he goes to his friends and they're like, dude, you're king, and it's good to be king, right? Mel Brooks, History of the World Part 2. All right, so, and of course, Rehoboam listens to the elders, and everything's fine. Of course not. He's going to listen to his friends. And he comes back and he says to the people of Israel, my dad beat you with whips. I will beat you with scorpions. Now, that's not picking up a bug and throwing it at someone. A scorpion is a cane reed that you put a nail at the end of, and this is how you drive camels. Okay? And then he makes a very crass, crude comment about his manhood versus his father's. And the people are like, yeah, we're out of here. So the 10 northern tribes break off and form the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember what I said, names change and move. Okay? Because originally, during the reign of David and Solomon, all of this area is Israel. But after Rehoboam, it shifts. This becomes Israel. The house of Judah, which this is the territory of Judah here, remains faithful to the house of David in Jerusalem. And they form the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the term Judah, notice it's connected to the geography. It was originally the tribal territory of Judah, but eventually, Judah becomes the basis for the term Jew. Because originally, they were just known as the Judeans. So the name Jew literally connects to the land of Judah. Okay? Now, I want to draw your attention over here, because here is on the coast, and this is the area of Philistia. What does that sound like from the Bible? Philistines. In fact, you'll notice we've got Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza. Yes, the same Gaza. Gath. Okay? They don't have Ekron, but Ekron is up here. Those are the 5 Philistine cities. And this land was known as Philistia. Now, when the term Philistia shifts into Greek, we see this already in the 5th century BC with Herodotus. He refers to this place here as Palestina. What does that sound like? Palestine. But notice it is a Greek name, or the Greek shift of Philistia. Okay? Now, ancient Greek and Roman writers who write about this landscape sometimes will refer to Palestine as the area of Philistia. The Jewish author of the 1st century, Josephus, does this. But some of the Greek writers who don't know this land, like Aristotle, for example, will refer to this whole landmass as Palestine. But when we jump to the 1st century, the time of Jesus, this area here, see, notice we still have Philistia over here, but this entire area here was known by the Romans as the Provincia Iudaea, the province of Judea. Okay? And that's the way that it's going to stay through the 1st century. Now you'll notice that you can even speak of Judea as just the southern part of the country, and Galilee and Samaria, terms that we hear about in the New Testament. But the entire province, from the standpoint of the Romans, is the province of Judea until the 2nd century. In the 2nd century, the Romans have endured 3 successive revolts by the Jews, and they're fed up with them. So, the Roman Emperor Hadrian kicks Jews out of Jerusalem. The only day that they could come there was on the 9th of the month of Av, which is in August, because that's the day upon which the temple was destroyed. And they were only allowed in the city of Jerusalem to mourn. They were kicked out of Jerusalem. And Hadrian is really going to drive the knife into the wound, because he's going to rename the province from Judea to Palestina after the Philistines. It's kind of like, let me really kind of pour some salt in there and poke you in the eye. All right? From this point on, this landmass west of the Jordan River becomes known as Palestine. But it is a geographic term, and this is what the Romans called it. In the Byzantine period, remember the Christian Romans? Okay, once they found Jesus, they call it Palestine. And on through the years, as people began to speak about this greater landmass that includes the lands west of the Jordan, the Transjordan, the area of Lebanon today, and Syria, it began to be called Syro-Palestine. That is a geographic designation. And this is very important to keep in mind, because as we move forward in time, even during that period when the British are in control, 1918 to 1948, okay, during that period, every person born in the lands west of the Jordan River, whether they be Jew or Arab, were known as Palestinians. There are Jewish Palestinians who were born during the Mandate period from 1918 to 1948, and it's on their birth certificate, Palestinian. Terms move and shift. So it's not only important to get our terms right, but we have to know what time we're speaking about. Does that make sense? You tracking with me? All right. Now we're going to jump way far ahead. Now we're in the Ottoman period. The Ottoman period, again, is 1518 down to 1918. And this is kind of a division of this land of Syro-Palestine under the Ottomans in the 19th century. Now, let's talk about the 19th century a little bit. The 19th century is where most historians of the modern Middle East begin telling their story. Most started in 1799, because that's when Napoleon and his forces invaded Egypt. Some will say, no, that's the first kind of real engagement of Europeans, and so what we really need to push it further to is after the time period of Muhammad Ali, at the end of his tenure, which is around 1827, and that's not Cassius Clay, that's like the guy that he was named after. So, but what I want you to notice here is that in this land, because here's Sea of Galilee, here's Dead Sea, here's Jordan River, right? That's just why we took a moment on the map before to get these places in our heads. Notice you have the districts of Acre, which is the area of Akko today. You have Nablus, which is ancient Shechem that you read about in the Bible. And then you have the district of Jerusalem, and hopefully we've all heard of that before. But please notice something here. In the Ottoman period, they're neither referring to this as the land of Israel, or they're neither referring to this as Palestine. Okay, this is all part of their empire, and they just break it up by these districts. Now, everybody with me so far? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Jews. One of the problems that we have as Protestants in understanding both Jews and Muslims is we tend to read their faith the way we read our faith. And for us, we have no sense of our faith tied to any place on the planet. You can be a Protestant Christian anywhere in the world, and you're a citizen there, that you're not tied to any spot on planet Earth, really. It's like, I am where I am, right? I can be a Protestant Canadian. I can be a Protestant American. I can be a Protestant German, right? No problem. We're kind of universal in that way. But going back already to the Old Testament, as Judaism begins to form as a faith, there are three things that mark a person as being a Jew in terms of doctrine. And Jews don't really talk about doctrine a lot, but there are three real things. Number one, there's only one God and He's ours. Number two, we are His chosen people, and that relationship is defined through the Scriptures. And number three, one land, the land that God gave us. Okay? So one God, one people, one book, you could say, and one land. Land is absolutely at the core of Jewish identity. Now, Jews never left this land. It was depopulated after those revolts we spoke about. Many were taken as slaves and sold as slaves. Many immigrated away from the country. But actually, in the mid-2nd century AD, large Jewish community out of Babylon immigrated into the land. So the land was never void of Jewish inhabitants. But the Jewish community, which has always been rather small, was more predominant after the 2nd century AD outside of the land than in it. Okay? But for 2,000 years, at every Passover, which Jews celebrate in the spring of the year, what do they say? Next year in Jerusalem. The land is absolutely a core part of the faith. And you have to understand this because that's going to frame certain things that we'll talk about here in a moment. Now, in the 18th century, there had been movements of Jewish communities into the land in the various centuries. For example, in the 13th and 14th centuries, after you have the Spanish Inquisition in Spain, there were Jews that immigrated into Jerusalem specifically. In fact, one of the great rabbis of the Middle Ages, a man by the name of Ramban, Nachmanides, if you know the name, he comes to Jerusalem with a group that is fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. But in the 18th century, Jews from Yemen, Morocco, North Africa, Iraq, they immigrated into 5 cities in the land west of the Jordan. These were religious Jews. They came here for religious reasons. The 5 cities were Hebron, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Tiberias, which Tiberias sits right here on the Sea of Galilee, and a place called Sfat, which is right where that A is. Okay? Now, when Europeans began in the early 19th century rediscovering this land, they took censuses in these cities because most people, this was still kind of the Wild West. Bandits, desert marauders, Bedouin, most people lived in cities. So when the Europeans come, and we have Russian censuses, we have French, we have British, we have German. In those 5 cities, there were more Jews than there were Arabs in the beginning of the 19th century. Okay? That dynamic shifts in the mid-19th century. Around 1860, 1870, the Ottomans, and the Ottomans, by the way, are not Arabs, right? Just like the Turks today are not Arabs. We all know that, right? So the Ottomans resettle in this land Arabs from other parts of their empire. And it's at this moment that the Arab population of the land exceeds the Jewish population, at least in the 19th century. That is also why today, if you look at Palestinian names, surnames, most of them indicate that they are coming from outside this territory, because their surnames are often connected to geographic regions where they originate. Now, why do I say all of this? I'm not trying to answer the question, whose land is it? I think that that's the wrong question that should be asked. But one of the narratives that is being pushed right now is that Israel is a colonizer and that they colonized the land away from the Arabs. You cannot colonize a land that does not have an indigenous population. Okay? In order to be a colonizer, you have to have had an indigenous population. That's not to say there weren't Arabs there also. But the majority of the Arab population is brought in the mid-19th century. Okay? That's why it's also important what I started out with. When you start telling your story matters. Now, what happens then, and most of what people know about this land as it relates to Jews begins in the late 19th century, the 1890s, 1900, 1910s, and you had a series of 4 immigrations into this land. Most of the Jews that were coming out of Russia and Eastern Europe. Most of them were also secular. Some people will look at that and say, well, you see, they're coming for colonial purposes. It doesn't matter if they're secular or not, because for 2,000 years, this land has been baked into the Jewish psyche. Okay? So even when you talk about someone who is Jewish and non-religious, Jewish identity still permeates their being. Okay? But nevertheless, you begin to have settlement in the late 19th century, so like 1890s, 1900, 1910, 1920. And they're going to primarily, and I'll show you some maps in a moment that will illustrate this, but they are going to primarily settle in agricultural areas and so forth. So, 1918 ends, World War I is over, and actually in 1916, right before the end of World War I, the French and the British get together and form what is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And basically what they did is they took a map of the Ottoman world and they drew right angles on it. And in human history, that has always worked out awesome. So, and this map is the way that the agreement was. So the area of what becomes Lebanon is going to be a French mandated territory and protectorate, because it's being set up to protect primarily the Christian Maronites. Okay? Then the area of Syria also gets set up as a separate French mandated territory, and that is going to be the area that is set for the Muslims. So they're trying to separate the Arab Christians, specifically the Maronites, from the Muslims. By the way, if you remember the 1970s, 80s, the war in Lebanon, this is the seeds of all that. The British, though, they're going to get the territory west of the Jordan River and the territory east of the Jordan River towards Iraq. So when we zoom in on this a little bit, they're going to get the area west, what is called Palestine, and the area of Transjordan. Okay? This is the British mandated area. All right? And by the way, what happens in 1946 when this area becomes its own independent kingdom, they just drop the trans from that, and that's how they get the Kingdom of Jordan. All right? Now, here is a map from the 1930s. So we're after the period of the mandate, or we're in the period of the mandate after 1918. And you'll notice this black area here. That is primarily where Jewish populations had settled. Okay? Remember I told you there were those 4 immigrations that take place from the 1890s on down? This is primarily where they're going to settle. Okay? And I want you to notice this. You see how this kind of looks like the letter N? Okay? You come up, come across, and go up. Okay? Now, most of this land, and if you've ever been to Israel, you've ever heard of the Israeli kibbutzim or a kibbutz, this is when the kibbutzim are starting. This is the immigrations that start the kibbutzim. But most of this land was swampland that gets converted into agricultural land. Now understand something here a second. The Turks do not care who is on the land. So in the 19th century and early 20th century, you had Jewish organizations like the Jewish National Fund. You had the Rothschild family, of which there's a French arm and an English arm, that would pull money together and go, and the Jewish community would go to Damascus, they would bargain with the local governor, and they would get the deed to the land. And then they would show up, and guess who's on the land? Local Arabs, the Fellahim, those who are farming. And they're like, we got the deed to the land, get out of here. And by the way, that's where part of the conflict starts. But understand that this is the settlement of Jewish settlement that has been developed from the 1890s down to 1930, okay? It's in that N, like the letter for Nancy. Now, 1937, there had been, starting in the 1920s, the Jews and the Arabs in British-mandated Palestine had had a number of conflicts. There were several, the Mufti, the chief Islamic official in Jerusalem, had said that the Jews were wanting to destroy the mosques that are on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and this led to a number of riots in places like Hebron, Jerusalem, Tiberias, Sfat, okay, Bethlehem. And so what happens then is the British create what's known as the Peel Commission to offer a separation of the land. Okay? The purple that you see here was to be an Arab state. The orange that you see there was to be a Jewish state. Now I want you to notice something a second. This is 1937. Look at this orange and then look at that. Does that look familiar? Okay? Then there was going to be from Jaffa, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there was going to be, because Jerusalem being a holy city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they needed it to be basically under British control and kind of then an international control on that. And actually the Jews were like, okay, but the local Arabs said no. Please note, there have been 6 offers, including 1937, to the local Arab communities living west of the Jordan River. This is the greatest extent of a state that they were ever offered. Every one of them, though, they've said no to. And we'll come back to why in a bit. Okay? So this is 1937, just as World War II is getting ready to kick off. 1944, because of World War II, there's more Jewish immigration. But again, what you can see is more or less a very similar settlement pattern. Of course, the British are going to restrict the settlement or the immigration of Jews that are trying to flee Europe because of the Holocaust. But nevertheless, some come in, and this becomes in 1944 kind of where Jewish settlement and land possession. The white, of course, this is where you had primarily Arab territory and settlement. So, 1946, the world in the wake of World War II forms the United Nations. And the United Nations then is going to create the partition plan of British-mandated Palestine. And this was the partition plan, that the white area would be a Jewish state, and the brown area would be an Arab state, and Jerusalem would be an international city that would be governed by the UN. Okay? Now, again, let's look at those borders for a Jewish state. Do those look familiar? So this narrative that is being repeated right now, that in 1948, the Jews came and took the land, it's false. The UN partition plan, like the Peel plan before it, is more or less rubber stamping what is already the reality in the land. Okay? Nobody is creating something that wasn't there. It was already there. And I've belabored this process of how it gets there. Because again, you're hearing right now that the Jews came in 1948, and because of the Holocaust, they were given this land. Facts, as John Adams said, are a stubborn thing. Okay? Now, again, let's go back here for 1 second. Again, the Jews said, we'll take it. Now, understand what they meant when they said, we'll take it. They were actually giving up Jerusalem. And there were some that were not for it. The man that became Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, said it's better for us to have something than nothing. And so, once again, though, the local Arabs, and please note, I'm not calling the local Arabs at this point Palestinian. And that's intentional, and I'll explain why in a moment. Local Arabs say no. So, conflict breaks out. And what happens then is 5 additional Arab armies from 5 Arab countries attack. And one of the things that happens, and I want to go back to this map for a second, because as you notice, you have Arab populations within this Jewish settlement pattern. And yes, it is true that there were Arab villages that Jewish forces slaughtered. Yes, it is true that there were Arab lands that Jews kicked them off of. That's true. But it's also true that those 5 invading Arab armies told the local Arabs, leave your lands, get to kind of where we can protect you. We're going to finish this off real quickly, and then you'll be able to go back to your lands. To everybody's shock, these are the armistice lines after 1948. Israel exists, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Here's the Gaza Strip. What color is that? What color is this? So from 1948 till 1967, the Gaza Strip is under the control of Egypt. Color is this? Bluish purple. All right, gray, whatever. West Bank, right? West Bank gets its name because it's assuming that it's attached to something on the East Bank. Notice the colors are the same. That's because Jordan controlled the West Bank from 1948 until 1967. Okay? Gaza Strip, West Bank. Gaza Strip was under control of Egypt. Notice from 1948 to 1967, Egypt did not create an independent state for the local Arabs. Notice that from 1948 until 1967, Jordan does not create an independent state for the local Arabs. Okay? So you have Israel, and what has happened is Jerusalem now is not an international city, but it's a divided city. Part of it is in Israel, part of it is in the West Bank, and then in Jordan. Okay? Let me kind of use the separation of Jerusalem at this period to illustrate something that I've said now several times. When you tell your story matters. In 1967, let's just go ahead and pop on this map here from 67. 1967, Israel takes East Jerusalem. That up until this time, East Jerusalem had been controlled by Jordan. And at that moment, when Israel takes East Jerusalem, the area, the oldest part of Jerusalem, what is known as the City of David. It's the most ancient heart of Jerusalem. 1967, there were Arabs that were living there, and the Israelis kicked them out. Okay? Sounds pretty awful, right? It's bad. They came in and they just kicked these people out of their homes. Right? Would it matter, though, if I told you that the City of David in the modern period was one of the first neighborhoods built outside of the old city of Jerusalem, and it was built by Jews, and it had been inhabited by Jews until 1948? And in 1948, it falls to, in East Jerusalem, to the Jordanians. And guess what the Jordanians do? Kick them out. When you start your clock matters how you tell the story. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not blood on both hands. But how you frame the story matters. And one of the problems that we have today is often, whether it's through the wonderful, enlightened TikTokers, or through our media, you have to pay attention when they start their clock. Because when they start telling their story is going to matter how they slant it to you. Now, 1967, we're going to move this on kind of quickly here and get to some Q&A. 1967, Israel is going to take the Sinai from Egypt, and that includes Gaza, and they're going to take the West Bank from Jordan, and they're going to take the Golan Heights from Syria, okay? And that really creates the beginning of this, of what we see in terms of the problem today. In the buildup to the 1967 war, the local Arabs had begun to develop a real national consciousness. Now, you could even argue that even as early as the 1920s and 30s, the local Arabs west of the Jordan River had started having a little bit of a national identity, but it really does not formulate until the 1960s, and specifically after 1967. And that is when you begin to call the local Arabs Palestinians. Because remember what I said, during the period of the Mandate, everybody that was born in the land, Jew and Arab, is a Palestinian. So even how you use your terms depends on when you are telling your story. So from 1967 is really where we begin to see the local Arab communities identifying themselves as Palestinians. Okay? And so this is the reality until we get to the Israel-Egypt peace treaty that was brought about by the Yom Kippur War, but it gets finalized in 1982, was finalized between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. You'll remember that it was originally agreed upon in 1979. There's the famous picture of Begin and Sadat and Jimmy Carter in the Rose Garden at the White House, and so forth. In that agreement, Israel gave the Sinai. Okay, remember the Sinai they take? In that agreement, they give the Sinai back and actually offered the Gaza Strip to Egypt. And Sadat said, "You choke on Gaza." Seriously. Okay? 1967, again, we have Gaza Strip, we have West Bank. This is the reality of the West Bank today. I'm going to explain this map by looking here for a second. In the early 90s, you had the creation of the Oslo Accords. And you'll remember the Oslo Accords were between Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the Nobel Peace Prize winning terrorist Yasser Arafat. Both are true. King Hussein of Jordan and President Clinton. The Oslo Accords were to be a temporary solution that would lead to ultimately a permanent peace. And what the Oslo Accords suggested were this: that the areas that are in kind of the dark green blue here, which are the main cities, Palestinian cities, would be under Palestinian police control and Palestinian civic control. Okay? That is what is called Area A. Israelis are not permitted to go into Area A. This is Jericho, Hebron, Bethlehem, Nablus, okay, Jenin, right? That's Area A. Then there are areas, the brown here, that Israel deemed that Palestinians could be there and Palestinians could administer the civic reality, but the military, because it was too sensitive, needed to remain in the hands of Israel. And that's what you call Area B. And then the rest of the area that Israel felt was necessary for them to control, and therefore the policing control, military control, and the civic control fell to the state of Israel, is Area C, and that's what these settlements that you read about in the news are. Okay? This is in 93. This is reality. Of course, in 95, as a result of his action on this, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by an Israeli, a Jew. And then Israel, through the late 90s, building up to 2000, has a series of terrorist attacks. In 2000, we have the breaking out in September of 2000 of the Second Intifada, where Palestinians coming out of the West Bank primarily would go to Tel Aviv, Netanya, Hadera, places along the Israeli coast, go to wedding halls, to cafes, and killed a lot of Israelis. And as a result of that, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, a man by the name of Ariel Sharon, basically builds a security fence around the West Bank. And in certain places, some of you have been to Israel and have gone to, like, say, Bethlehem, have seen the wall that's there. Okay, that was a result of this. Okay, right before the Intifada broke out, the prime minister at that time, a man by the name of Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat went to Camp David, and Barak offered Arafat and the Palestinians a state, more than they'd even ever been offered up to that point. And the answer was no. Okay, that's 4 times that they were offered, and the answer was no. Then in 2008, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, made another offer, and this was 98% of what you see here in the West Bank, and the 2 large Israeli settlements, one is called Ariel and the other is called Ma'ale Adumim. They were going to allow those to stay, but they had given them land swaps to compensate for the land. 98%. I just want to say something here a second. If you went into a business deal knowing you were going to get 98% of what you were asking for, where do I sign? But the answer came back, no. You say, why? Why is the repeated no's? And for this, we have to talk a little bit about Islam. Islam looks at the world as divided into 2 camps. You have what is called Dar al-Islam, which is the world of Islam. That doesn't just mean something that is esoteric or ideological. That means literally any inch of planet Earth that has ever been ruled by Islam. That is Islamic land. It is sacred land. The term that is used in Arabic for it is it's waqf. You do not get to unwaqf land. So I want to take you back here for a second. We'll go to this map. In the history, everything from the river to the sea, heard that recently? Has been Islamic land at some point in history. You do not get to unwaqf land. Just like you also don't get to rebrand a statement from the river to the sea and make it a peaceful cry for freedom. Okay? So, if land is ever ceded because of conflict that was part of Dar al-Islam, your job as a faithful Muslim is to retake it. The rest of the world is defined as Dar al-Harb, which means the world of the sword. And that is the land that a faithful Muslim is to struggle with in order to make it Dar al-Islam. So when you ask the question, why, when offered 6 different times some kind of statehood, has the answer been no? you have to understand that lurking behind this is an ideology that, frankly, we do not understand. And then finally, we come to Gaza. This is today the Gaza Strip. Okay? 2005, under the Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, Israel removed all Israelis that had settled in Gaza. There has not been an Israeli in Gaza since 2005. So anybody that calls this occupied territory, sorry. Hasn't been since 2005. 2006, 2007, there was an election here, and Hamas defeated the Palestinian Authority, what is called Fatah. And to celebrate their election, they annihilated all of Fatah that was in Gaza. They took the leader of Fatah to the tallest tower in Gaza City to see if he could fly, and he couldn't. So that was kind of the end of that. So since 2007, the Gaza Strip has been controlled by Hamas. Okay? Understand a couple of things when we talk about Gaza and Israel, because I'm sure as we get ready to have some questions that this may come up. Gaza is not Israel. Israel is not Gaza. Just like Canada is not the United States, and the United States is not Canada. So when people want to talk about crossings and all of this other kind of stuff, understand foreign country, foreign country. That is an international barrier. Now, whether or not they want to recognize it as such, that is the reality. Okay? And if I want to go into Canada, I am going to have to go through a checkpoint. That's just life. That's reality. Okay? And so, of course, what brings this all to a head is on October 7th, members of Hamas breached that border and committed the largest day of slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The largest day of Jewish slaughter ever in the history of the state of Israel. And anyway, I think we'll stop here and take some questions.
1 second, Mark. We'll have about 20, 30 minutes of questions. Ashley, you can go ahead and get the chairs out. I'll let you ask questions in a moment. I want you to talk for a moment. One of the things we talked about a lot in Israel was, and we talked about this the other night when we were talking to a pastor friend in South Africa about it, the Jewish identity of Jesus and why that's important for us to understand today. And you said something on the phone the other night that really moved me. You said if Jesus would have been alive on October 7th in the southern part of Israel, he would have been targeted simply because of his identity. Help us understand why that's important for us today to recognize his identity, and then help us see some of the subtle anti-Semitic tones of the gospel as we know it in America, because we talked a lot about this Palm Sunday, the kind of Nine Tails, even every movie that's ever been made of Jesus. Just help us understand a little bit of that so we can have a better understanding of what's happening right now.
Our faith is built upon the reality of the incarnation, that God entered human time, space, and culture. Paul says in Galatians chapter 4 that in the fullness of time God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. To deny Jesus his identity ethnically, actually is to deny the incarnation. Jesus was not a man for all peoples. You go with me to Israel today, and you go into Nazareth, Jesus' boyhood home, and there in the church in Nazareth, you will see depictions of Jesus and his mother Mary from all over the world. And every culture depicts Jesus and Mary looking like them, but that's not true. Jesus was Jewish, and that was not something that was just skin deep. Please note, the only two details the Gospels give us about the physical identity of Jesus. One is that he was circumcised. In the first century, I could stand up 100 non-Jewish men, and based on that solitary detail in the Gospels, you could pick Jesus out. We don't know how tall he was. We don't know his skin color. We don't know his eye color. We don't know how big or bushy his beard was. We don't know any of that. We know he was circumcised. The other detail, you say, well, his parents had that done to him. What does a kid 8 days old really have a say in that? But the other detail is the fact, remember the woman with the issue of blood? What does she reach to touch? His tassels. The tzitzit. So here Jesus is an adult. Not all Jewish men even in the first century wore the tzitzit. It was a sign of great devotion. And Jesus was wearing it. In fact, I would even say the reason Jesus dies on the cross, and in fact, the plaque that is put and affixed to his cross is actually Roman anti-Jewish attitudes and an open mocking of Jewish hopes of redemption. And the reality was, had Jesus been alive on October 7th and in the south of Israel, he would have been killed by Hamas terrorists just simply because he was a Jew. And I think what's important for us as people of faith is, one, to recognize that very simple but very profound fact. And secondly, we're also required then to ask the question, if that's true, then what does that mean in terms of how I read and understand Jesus? Because Jesus is as much a historical figure as Abraham Lincoln or Alexander the Great, or pick your favorite musician or athlete or whomever. And if you wanted to get to know your favorite person in history, you're not going to deny them their identity. And if Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then that doesn't mean we get to make him in our image. That means he is and he was who he was. And often what happens is we have had this tendency to deny him that. And it comes in subtle ways. But I think that right now, with everything that's gone on over the last 6 weeks, that we're maybe more acutely aware of anti-Semitism. But let me say this, anti-Semitism has been with us for almost 2,000 years in Christianity. It's been in our theology. It's been in our teaching and preaching. And I'm not saying that any of us are Nazis. But the reality is, the only Christian group that has ever, A, tried to repent for what happened in the 20th century to the Jewish people, and B, tried to grapple with the reality of the Jewish people in Israel, is the Catholic Church in Vatican II. We Protestants have not had any formal repentance on this, but yet many people in Protestant churches today want to be a kind of a prophetic voice of criticism to the state of Israel. And absolutely, I believe, in fact, I think that that's what Paul teaches in Romans 11, that The Gentile believers are to be a prophetic voice to Israel, but it's kind of hard to have a prophetic voice when you haven't repented for the sins you've committed for 2,000 years.
One of the things Marc taught me years ago, traveling with him, is the more I understand Jesus and his time and place, the more relevant he becomes in my time, in my place. So if I don't impose on him that he's this 20th century, 21st century American, but I see him for who he is, he becomes much more relevant in my time and place. Let's have a couple questions that you have.
Is driving into this event this evening, I was listening to Christian radio, and Dr. Jack Graham was on the radio along with a rabbi, and they were going back even further, tying in the Amalekites to Haman in Esther to then Hamas. Can you comment on that?
All right, so the question is this trying to tie in the Amalekites, and of course the Amalekites we read about in the book of Exodus, that they're part of the ones who are troubling the Israelites on their journey to the Promised Land. And then also Haman, you remember from the Esther story, that tries to wipe them out, and also Hamas. There is no genealogical connection at all. One of the things that you have to understand there is that within Jewish tradition, because of the way that the Amalekites are always this problem, and you'll remember that ultimately the sin that Saul creates is he doesn't wipe out the Amalekites. Right? And you'll remember that the guy that comes and tells David that Saul is dead is an Amalekite, right? And everything like this. But because of that, in Jewish tradition, Amalek, or the Amalekites, are identified as everybody that's ever tried to do anything bad to Israel. And yeah. So it's coming out of that, but as far as any real kind of connection, there's not.
Let me just say, he probably won't say it. I'll say it a little bit harder. One of the things I've learned traveling in Israel and studying the land and studying with Marc and actually digging into archaeology, history, is we have a lot of preachers in America that like to make connections that aren't there. And especially if you're listening to Christian radio or Christian television, we have a lot of connections that we're just pulling out of a hat, but there is no factual basis for them at all, but you can sell books. And so it helps, I guess their book sales, but there's no reality to it. Is there any connection between the national identity of Gaza and West Bank? Do they see themselves as one, or is it two separate people groups?
That's actually a good question. And so, yes and no. So now Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are almost like two political rivals as it relates to the Palestinian people. You do have, Palestinian families in the West Bank that have relatives and family in Gaza. You also have, though, because of the nature of Egypt controlling Gaza and the Gaza Strip and Jordan, the West Bank, you also have some differences of peoples and groups in there as well. And that's one of the things that has also come to light, that recent Israeli governments have been funding and fueling Hamas because they want to keep things fractured. Because if there's going to be ever this idea of a two-state Israel and a Palestinian state, then you're going to have to solve the issue of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip being separated. And so recent Israeli governments have been kind of even funneling money to Hamas to try and strengthen them, to destabilize and to keep things at this kind of impasse on the Palestinian front, in order to not have to deal with those issues.
When we were in Israel, you told us a little bit about the refugee status, the UN, how the UN has their law, it's second or third generation, you get refugee status, but they've not allowed that for many of the people there. Can you explain that to us and why that's important?
All right, so after World War II in the UN, there was created, what is it, the UN Human Rights Organization, I believe, that is to handle all refugee status. And the reality of refugee status legally, according to international law, so let's say you had to flee a country, okay? And you and your wife fled to a different country for, safety, political issues, whatever. You are a refugee. Now, if you had a child in that foreign country, your child cannot claim refugee status. You're the refugee, not your child. Okay? So, therefore, it dies with you, whether you become a naturalized citizen or whatever so that would be the general way it works for everybody in the world. There was also set up in the 1950s with the UN an organization that was set up to handle the Palestinian refugee situation because 750,000 Arabs were displaced as a result of the 1948 war. And they were unsuccessful, and their period of mandate ran out. Palestinians asked that they continue and asked that the UN tag be kept on it. And this organization today is known as UNRWA. Okay? UNRWA is a Palestinian-run organization. It is the second largest employer of Palestinians in the world after the Palestinian Authority. And UNRWA does not follow international law as it goes towards the issue of refugees. So they claim not just refugee status for the people that were displaced, but for their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren. And now we're into 7 generations of it. Moreover, they count as refugees those people that originally were displaced, even if they went to a foreign country and gained citizenship in that foreign country. And so you will hear this language of, these millions and millions of Palestinian refugees. But that's, again, not something that is a reality according to international law, but it's kind of...
I think we have people in Congress that are Palestinian refugees and U.S. citizens. So that is an issue that you hear about a lot, and so I just wanted to help you understand a little bit why when you hear this thing on Palestinian refugees. We've got time for about 2, maybe 3 questions.
I've got one. So it goes back to Jerusalem and is it Wafa, you said?
The Waqf?
Walk.
The Wafa, okay.
Like Spain. Spain is part of that. So their plan is to retake Spain one day.
Right. So what is it about Jerusalem specifically that the Arabs lay claim to, other than having...
Well, okay, so according to Islamic tradition, the area of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is where Muhammad comes to ascend to heaven on his night journey. Now, immediately if someone knows the Quran, they'll say, well, Jerusalem's never mentioned in the Quran, and they're right, it's not. And it seems that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is what is referenced in the Quran, is somewhere probably in Arabia or something like that. That said, by the 7th century, 8th century, when you have what is known as the Umayyad dynasty, which was based out of Damascus, and the Golden Dome that you've seen was built by one of the Umayyad caliphs. By that time, they're already identifying it with Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem becomes sacred to Islam. as well. It's one of the 3 holy cities in Islam. And you can say, well, okay, it wasn't in there in the Quran, and Muhammad was never there, but Islamic tradition develops just like Christian tradition develops. And so that's why.
Vince? Victoria?
Yeah, so I don't know, this may be a hard one for you to answer, Mark, but you're trying to suss out what we hear from media and whatnot. What would you say, I don't know if you can answer this, but what would you say, what do you think an average Israeli citizen now is holding down and is going to be?
It's actually a very interesting question. Because the majority of Israelis see what happened on October 7th as being existential. It's not political. So what's happened is those who were center left and left are still center left and left. Those who are center right and right are still there. They're still driving in their political alleyways. But they're all basically coming to this realization that it's either us or them, and it's not going to be us. And so I think that what this has done is it has pushed the chances for peace further away. Because Israel, after what happened on October 7th, Israel feels they have no choice but to completely dismantle Hamas. And it doesn't really matter what the international community says. Okay? Hamas showed who they were on October 7th. Okay? Beyond that, Israel now also is making this claim. And whether or not we agree with it, we at least have to understand it. We withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip in 2005. We left infrastructure. The northern part of the Gaza Strip where the Israeli settlements were was filled with, greenhouses and agriculture, and they left it, right? And the government of Israel displaced 8,000 Israeli citizens when they did this. And it really was very problematic for Israel. But they're like, we pulled out in 2005, and the world has given billions of dollars to Hamas. Understand that the 3 leaders of Hamas are billionaires. That's according to Forbes. Okay? It pays to be a terrorist. And the thing is, there is no incentive, by the way, for them to change any of their behaviors or tactics because they've gotten filthy rich off this. But Israel's sitting here looking at this. We pulled out. They were given billions of dollars. Instead of building what could have been a Riviera, because the only sandy beaches on the Mediterranean are in Israel, and Gaza has the best beaches. So they could have built a Riviera. Instead, they're building over 200 miles of tunnels and rockets and on and on and on. And so the point now in Israel's mind is, we gave them all of this, and this is what we get in return. Do you seriously think we're going to displace almost 1 million settlers now in the West Bank? And because the West Bank abuts Jerusalem, do you really think we're going to do this now? And again, whether or not we agree with their logic on that, you've at least got to understand the logic on that. Because the other thing that I will say with this is, when Hamas is sitting here in their charter calling for the destruction of the state of Israel and setting up an Islamic state from the river to the sea, and this is what everybody's chanting today and tweeting and whatever, that Israel is in a position, again, whether they're left or right, where they basically see themselves as fighting for their existence.
In closing, Mark, what encouragement would you give us as believers on how we should stand right now with everything going on?
I think we have to be careful. I've heard really stupid statements from the pro-Palestinian and the pro-Israeli sides. I think one of the things that, people say this is a complicated and a complex situation, and it is to a degree. I'm not saying I have a solution. I'm not smart enough to have a solution. But one of the problems is we have a lot of ignorance that is out there right now. And I think that we have to be careful in perpetuating that. That does not, because ultimately, our call is to be representative of our Lord. And Jesus never looks good when we make him sound really ignorant. And so I would say that if you haven't done some real kind of study on the background here, and hopefully tonight I've at least tried to give you kind of some guardrails of how to think about even how you would go and explore it. But if you haven't done that, then I would probably not have a really fixed opinion on the situation. I think that there are people that are hurting on all sides of this. And the Bible teaches us to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. I have people, family, people that work for me that are Jewish Israelis, that are Arab Israelis. I also employ Palestinian Muslims. And I've been walking through this with both of them, both sides, because I feel that that's what we're called to do. But that also doesn't mean that we don't look at evil and try and justify it. That also doesn't mean that we try and provide context to the stuff that was done on October 7th. There is no context for that. It's demonic, satanic. And so I think that as believers, we need to educate ourselves. I think that we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, like the Bible instructs us to. I think that we need to be very careful of where we get pulled, which ways we get pulled. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for Mark and his life, his experience, his wisdom. God, that he can help us understand a little bit more this special place on planet Earth, God. And Lord, we do pray for the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of Israel, that your favor would rest over that land, Lord. We thank you, Jesus. In everything we do and everything we say, let us keep you first and foremost in it all. In Jesus' name, amen.